I'm audible enough? I'm well audible.
Yeah, you're audible, Isha.
Okay. So hello everyone. This is the another session of the Friends of Elephant. So today the Friends of Elephant is coming up with a new topic. Before going into the topic, let me say a little bit about the Friends of Elephant. So Friends of Elephant is not an organization. It is not proposing to be one. It is an informal group of people coming together with varied expertise and concern about the elephants and other wildlife. The group is a forum for disseminating the knowledge linked to the elephants and other wildlife sciences, conservation, and welfare through art, culture, literature, movies, talks, and panel discussion. Our expectation is that people who have attended our event gain knowledge in a very informal way and also on their own and or with their proximity to the people for policy making, help in developing appropriate conservation and welfare measures for wildlife, including the elephants. So today's topic that Friends of Elephant is coming up with in collaboration with Wildlife Trust of India (WTI), the elephants and the disease. It is mainly focuses on the health and conservation perspectives. So the schedule somehow goes like this. The introduction will be done by me. I'm Esha, and the talk will be on disease, health, and elephant conservation by Dr. Bindu Raghavan. And it will the conversation of the panelists will be with Dr. K. Rajesh Kumar on the same topic. And at the last, but not the least, there will be a question answer session, which will be moderated by Anikethan Hathwar. So before going into the whole discussion, let's introduce ourselves, who will be today's moderate introduction and the speakers. So I am Esha. I work as a researcher in Asian Elephant Research and Conservation Programs of Asian Nature Conservation Foundation, ANCF in Bangalore. I have completed my master's degree in forestry from Forest Research Institute, Dehradun, and I have the specialization of wildlife and habitat management. While being part of ANCF, I has been associated with various assignments, and especially I have been working on the economical assessment of elephant barriers of BRT Tiger Reserve. And my research interest is mostly habitat ecology and wildlife management. Along with my research work, I am volunteering for different national and international organizations for being part of the nature education outreaching program and social welfare. So our first speaker is Dr. Bindu Raghavan. So she is one of the veterinarian in PhD who has been working in immunology and infectious disease from Washington State University, Pullman in 2016. She has worked as a scientist in epidemiology and animal health and at the Colombian Corporation for investigation in agriculture livestock in Colombia, and was a professional fellow of Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun. Currently, she is the principal scientist of wildlife diseases in Center for Wildlife Studies in Bangalore. Her research interests broadly include biodiversity conservation and sustainable use of the natural resources. Specifically, she is interested in the infections between human, livestock, and wildlife, especially at the resource use and the disease interface, and the role of the disease as a driver of wildlife population dynamics. She uses a combination of ecological, microbiological, immunological, and geospatial epidemiology. Sorry. Uh, Kindly mute yourself if you have almost nothing to say because it's kind of disturbing. Uh, so she is working in a combination of ecological, microbiological, immunological, geospatial, and epidemiological tools to understand the factors that impact animal health, environmental health, and the human health and well-being. Currently, she is working on the project investigating the role of community health on the wildlife conservation in the Mudumalai Tiger Reserve. So our next speaker and the panelist is Dr. K. Rajesh Kumar. He has graduated from Madras Veterinary College in 2008. He joined the Tamil Nadu Animal Husbandry Department in 2010. He served in the Nilgiris for 6 years, then in Coimbatore for 3 years, and joined Forest Veterinarian Mudumalai Tiger Reserve on October 2020. Throughout his career, he worked in for animal disease. He has attended more than 100 postmortem of the wild animals, served as a full-time veterinarian of the Temple Elephant Rejuvenation Camp in Tamil Nadu government for 3 years, and is serving as a full-time veterinarian of the forest elephant camp at Mudumalai Tiger Reserve. He led the ground veterinarian team for six wild elephant treatment, capture, rescue, translocation operation, and also in that of the bear, leopard, tiger, etc. For past 10 years, he has headed the team for the immunization of the domestic cattle in the forest fringe areas in various parts of Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. And our final moderator is Anikethan, who has completed his bachelor's degree from MES College in measuring of CBZ and is an intern and volunteer in various assignments such as a plantation campaign, urban wildlife rescue under the SWAT and the volunteering barrier assessment project in Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, MML's Wildlife Sanctuary and BRD Tiger Reserve, Bannerghatta National Park. He is also a Rajya Purishkar rover of the Bharat Scouts and the Guides and has taken part of numerous adventures and service activities. Currently, he works as a researcher and intern in citizen science research and education program under ANCF in short and long-term assignments. So that is this brief discussion and introduction of all the speakers and whoever the people will be moderating. So now I would like to request Dr. Raghavan to share if you have a screen to share or your presentation as such so that we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esha, for the introduction and for introducing ANCF and all of you guys to us. I'm just going to share my screen now. Can you see my screen here?
Yes, ma'am. It's
visible.
As a slideshow now?
Yeah.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about disease, health, and elephant conservation. I was asked to give a talk on how wildlife disease affects conservation. What is the importance of disease in wildlife, and how it affects wildlife populations, specifically in terms of elephant conservation. So I will give a very brief, broad outline of wildlife diseases, what are the drivers and what are the impacts on populations, and then talk about very briefly about elephant conservation, because then we will have a nice Q&A with Dr. Rajesh, who is also a field vet and has been dealing with elephant health and diseases in the field. So we've all heard about, how the lions, we lost 24 lions and more in Gir due to canine distemper virus in India. And how, now we are losing several animals. So we are having issues with trichinophorus disease that is transmitted from monkeys to humans. There's Nipah virus transmission that is coming from bats to humans. We've also had vulture deaths due to toxicology from a veterinary drug called diclofenac, which is being used in livestock, treatment of livestock, which is what the vultures feed on. You've heard of the Tasmanian devil and the facial tumor disease that they have. Elk are increasingly susceptible, elk and moose are increasingly susceptible to parasitic infections, which is leading to starvation and death in these animals and changing the population structure and composition. You've also had, excuse me. May I request everybody else to please mute your microphones, because it's very distracting when someone is talking. Okay, and also about fungal disease in amphibians, which has led to death of amphibians across the globe in all kinds of habitats and regions. So what are the drivers? Diseases can impact not just the individual health when it comes to wild animals, but and also other animals, but also herd health. So it actually impacts reproductive parameters. For example, there might be lesser number of young that are recruited into the next year. The females just might not reproduce in a particular year if they've suffered from certain diseases, or the young that are born are so weak and unable to fend for themselves and they die soon after birth. So recruitment is affected due to diseases. Disease can thus also change population structure. So some populations of wildlife might have more adults because of lack of recruitment, or if adults are being killed, then there might be very few reproductive adults left to take the population forward, and then you might have a decline of that population. It can also affect population composition. As I said, in terms of herd living animals where you have hierarchical structures among the males, or the females, it could lead to removal of the alpha males or the alpha females, and that leads to problems with the herd composition, and that can or the group composition, and that can lead to behavioral and other issues within that group of animals, and thus also affect their population survival and viability. So what are the drivers of disease in wildlife? The major driver of disease in wildlife is deforestation and habitat degradation. More and more human activities have led to the fragmentation of forests and just complete destruction of habitats, conversion to single monoplantations, or to crop fields, or to tea gardens or coffee plantations or human crop systems, to livestock production systems, intensive livestock production systems, to mining, for logging and felling, and other intensive practices that have changed the composition of not just the plants, but not just the habitat, but also the soil and the water sources in these areas. So these lead to increased incidences of diseases. Parasites that were previously found only within these dense forests are now able to come out of these forests because the forests have been cut down, and now more and more animals, more and more hosts are exposed to these pathogens, and these pathogens are now able to move out of the forest into newer areas, into newer hosts, leading to spread of disease. And intensification of industrialization and pollution, intensive farming, as I told you, and the antibiotics and hormones and chemicals and pesticides that come out from there. Also, the trade in wildlife and wild meat, illegal trade and illegal hunting has also increased the risk of diseases in wildlife, and also in humans, as we will see later. So how does fragmentation of forests affect that? As we know that, when you have a forest like this, an intact forest where you have certain species of animals, this is known as the interior. And then you have a forest edge, which is the part of the forest which is now blending into the rest of the matrix which is surrounding that forest. Could be agricultural land, could be plantation, monoplantations, could be crop fields, could be human habitations. And then these areas also have certain different specific kinds of species that inhabit this edge area. But when forests are fragmented, say through the construction of a road, or through deforestation, or through degradation of this habitat, then the intact forest, the interior part of the forest, becomes very small, and the species that are within that forest are now forced to move out into the edge areas, which now become bigger. And so the same thing happens even with vectors that carry different disease-causing pathogens, as also with pathogens themselves. Once the host species start moving out from the forest and start interacting more with the humans and livestock in these areas outside the edge, then you have an increased interface for interaction between those pathogens and humans and livestock. Fragmentation also causes movement of species, not just out of the forest, but also to different areas, to different forests, and thus there is a shift in the range. That again means that more and more hosts can be infected by the pathogens. The species can carry these pathogens out of the original area where they were found. And climate change exacerbates this entire effect because of suddenly cold areas have become warmer, and vectors are now finding it easier to be to invade these colder areas. You have the hot tropics where diseases are now ever increasing even more because of the influx of more and more different kinds of vectors and pathogens. And so climate has also exacerbated the whole situation. You have movement of wild animals out into the human-dominated landscapes, which means there is an increased interaction between humans, livestock, and wildlife, and increased interchange of diseases between them. So these are just pictures of how, all kinds of wild animals, birds and carnivores and ungulates are now mixing with not just humans, but also with domestic animals. And you can see how close these animals are. They're grazing on the same pastures, they're drinking from the same water resources. So if, for example, the buffalo are infected, say with brucella, then there is a very high chance that these wild deer that are sharing the same pastures might be infected with brucella too. Or a rhino here could be infected with the same parasites that these livestock are carrying, and they may not have protective responses against these pathogens or parasites, and that can result in disease issues and health issues in these wild animals. And we've also now, thanks to COVID-19, also learned that wild animals can also pass on diseases to humans, and these are known as zoonotic diseases, diseases that are spread from animals to humans. Usually in these cases, humans are not really the actual host, intended host for the pathogens, but just because they have come into contact with animal hosts, in most of the cases it's wild animal hosts, then humans are also infected. And it's estimated that up to 75% of new diseases that affect people over the past 10 years have originated from animals. Of these, roughly about 60% have come from wild animals. And over 150 zoonotic diseases are transmitted to humans by both wild and domestic animals. Of these, 13 are responsible for 2.2 million deaths per year. And this includes influenza, all the different kinds of influenza, tuberculosis, rabies. We haven't added COVID-19 here because this was an older picture, but COVID-19 will now take a big spot here. The important thing is that COVID-19 is just one of several pandemics that have originated from or zoonotic diseases that have originated from animals in the past, and there have been many other big killers. But what's interesting to note is this number, that controlling or eradicating zoonotic diseases in animals is more effective, and let me tell you, also cheaper and more easier than in humans, just because of the way humans move around and humans interact with different groups, the kind of lifestyle practices we have, it is very difficult to, as we have seen with COVID-19, to control a disease in humans. Whereas controlling epidemics and pandemics in animals is much easier. And I'm talking about livestock. In wildlife, it is much easier to to screen and monitor for these diseases much before they become an issue, and thus save us a lot of time, money, and effort, and of course, lives. And these are the usual scapegoats. Wildlife are the typical scapegoats for zoonotic diseases. You have bats and civets who've been implicated in the SARS and pangolin, in the SARS epidemics that have happened over the years. You have the minks and camels, and other wildlife are also often persecuted because of this. The monkeys because of Kaizen forest disease, rodents because of all the ticks that they carry, and the scrub typhus that is spread through ticks. You have jackals and foxes who scavenge in human habitations and are considered carriers of diseases. Wild pigs, wild birds, especially wetland birds, are now associated with the spread of avian influenza. But the problem is not actually wildlife, it is humans. It is we who have actually gone and imposed ourselves into wildlife areas, into wildlife habitations, into forests, and cut down forests and increased fragmentation, degradation of these habitats, which has led to the outflux of these animals, their pathogens and the vectors for those pathogens out into areas where humans and their animals live. And wildlife also suffer from diseases. Like I said, it not only affects their health, but also their population viability. And there is also reverse zoonosis, which impacts wildlife populations. So this is when diseases move from humans to animals. COVID-19 is a very good example. COVID-19 has now been found in tigers and lion populations, and cats and dogs and mink, and even white-tailed deer in North America have been infected by COVID-19, and we still don't know the situation with wildlife in India because we haven't screened for these agents. So they also act, reverse zoonosis not just impacts wildlife, but also acts as a source of reinfection for humans. Tuberculosis is a very good example. So bovine and human tuberculosis has been found in captive elephants and is a global problem in elephants that have been kept in zoos across the world. And, there is no reason to think that it may not be occurring in wild elephants either, because the tuberculosis organism has come, that is mainly found in captive elephants, has come from humans. And so we have such a strong interface of interaction between humans and elephants in our country. It is very difficult to believe that there is no cross transmission of tuberculosis. You also have had disturbing news of bacterial infections such as Salmonella and Campylobacter, which are typically found in humans, which are now found in seabirds in the Antarctic, including the emperor penguins. And that is really disturbing, how all of these infections have now spread to the Antarctic, where they were not typically found. So although this looks like a complex picture, but I'd like to break it down for you how biodiversity and human health are interlinked. As I had told you before, anthropogenic processes such as agriculture and transport and energy production and resource extraction, urbanization, hunting, and then you have climate change that has been induced through all of these anthropogenic processes, all affect forest structure through effects on plant structure. Now, plant structure also has an effect on vector communities, right? Because these vectors live or utilize these plant structures to survive and to carry out their different life stages. Plant structure also has an impact on the abiotic environment through the water cycle, the nutrient cycle in the soil, and vice versa. The abiotic environment, if the water cycle is impacted, that has an impact on plant structure too. And similarly, plant structure has an impact on animal communities, food plants, for example, or plants that are used, trees that are used for shelter. Now, if plant structure is impacted, then that impacts animal communities. And if animal communities that typically say graze plants or that browse on plants and help in dispersal of these plants, if these animal communities are affected, then the plant structure is affected too. So it's a cycle. And again, changes in animal communities also affect vector communities, as I had told you earlier, through dispersal and migration of these animals. Changes in abiotic environment through change in temperature, humidity, and other environmental variables also impact vector communities. Now, animal communities, the more the number of hosts, what we have found is that the more what scientists call the dilution effect for a pathogen. So if a pathogen has a wide variety of hosts, then it kind of gets diluted and it is not able to have such a great impact on any one population. Whereas the lower the number of host types, the larger the impact that pathogen will have on that particular host community. So this is known as a single pathogen risk. The greater the impacts on vector communities, the changes in vector communities, the greater the risk for a single pathogen disease. And this can also lead to more and more pathogens that are now emerging or coming to the system. And then there is the sum of total disease risk increases. The total disease risk increases because now you have several different pathogens that are operating in this ecosystem. And that in turn increases the total infectious disease burden. And that affects our index of well-being, not just for humans, but also for animals. Now, all of these anthropogenic processes can also directly affect total infectious disease burden through human behavior. For example, as we have seen with COVID-19, when we have carried infection into protected areas or to wildlife or to other animals, and helped in the increase of zoonotic diseases, reverse zoonosis. You also have non-infectious disease factors such as lifestyle diseases, all coming from these anthropogenic processes, including cancer and stress-related diseases, mental health issues. All of these are non-infectious disease factors which also feed into our index of well-being. So what we have found is that there is a non-linear relationship between the risk of disease and the diversity of hosts. So as biodiversity decreases, the disease risk also increases up to a certain point. And then there is a dip in the graph, mainly because as host diversity decreases, host numbers also decrease, and then the pathogen does not have as many hosts to go, so the disease risk also comes down. But what is important is this peak here. So coming now to the Asian elephants, the Asian elephant is actually a flagship species. Why? Because the Asian elephant, because of its size, is it needs a lot of energy and a lot of food that it needs to consume to maintain that body, to maintain its bodily functions, and that means that it needs to eat a lot of food. It eats about 150 kg of plant matter every day and consumes about 18 to 20 liters of water every day. So it needs to access water resource at least once a day. Because of this, it needs a large area in which it has to roam and to eat and to maintain its, regular social and reproductive behaviors. So, which means that to protect one elephant, you need a very large area. And within that large area, you have many other species that get conserved thanks to the conservation of this one elephant. When you protect an entire herd of elephants, you are assisting to help conserve many other different species that are now living in that forest. And that is why the elephant is known as a flagship species. The elephant is also very close, interacts very closely with humans. As we've all seen and heard, it comes into human habitations very frequently, which leads to a lot of conflict. It is not afraid of livestock. It interacts with livestock very closely, grazes in the same areas. They mostly use the same water resources. Elephants also come in to feed on raid crops and come into human habitations looking for food. So there is a great interface between elephants and humans and livestock, much more so than I think with many other wildlife. And so elephants are very susceptible to not just zoonotic diseases, but also diseases that can be transmitted from livestock to them. And vice versa, elephants could also pass on or transfer diseases. They could act as an unsuspecting carrier for diseases from one area to another and affect livestock, which then affects human livelihoods and well-being. So in that sense, elephants are truly a flagship species, not just in terms of conservation, but also in terms of health and well-being of the ecosystem. So this is just to show the current distribution of Indian elephant in the Indian subcontinent, and especially in India. And we have had elephants that have strayed from these populations. Initially arose from populations that had dispersed from the Eastern Ghats and went up to Odisha and Andhra and Telangana. And now these populations moved into Chhattisgarh, and from Chhattisgarh, some elephants have roamed into Madhya Pradesh. And all they're doing is looking for areas that they can inhabit away from humans, looking for food, looking for water, looking to expand, because while their populations have remained either stable or have expanded, their habitats have decreased. And so now they have nowhere to go. So they are now venturing out into newer areas, including human habitations. And as I mentioned, because elephants come in such close contact with livestock, the diseases that they are threatened with are also diseases that actually they share with livestock, such as anthrax, hemorrhagic septicemia, which is a very characteristic disease of livestock, especially cattle. Trypanosomiasis, again, they share trypanosoma parasites between cattle and them. There are several gastrointestinal parasites that are shared between elephants and domestic livestock. Tuberculosis, as I had mentioned, is probably a threat which has been underestimated, and we still do not have much information of tuberculosis threat disease risk in wild elephants, in India especially. You have the ever-increasing threat from a new virus, the elephant endotheliotropic herpes virus, which has definitely caused 100% fatalities in captive elephants where it has been found. And it has been detected in wild elephants in southern India and also in Odisha. But we still don't know what the prevalence is and what impact it has on the populations of wildlife. Other diseases such as brucellosis, which are common in cattle, is something we have no idea about. And whether black water is another bacterial disease that is common in livestock, and we still do not know what is happening in terms of these diseases in our free-ranging elephant populations, and how, in fact, that might impact elephants. So, elephants elephant disease can actually impact herd structure and composition, as I spoke earlier. Just as in other wild animals, in elephants too, for example, an anthrax that kills adults can lead to skewed population structure where you have more younger animals than adults, and you need these adults, especially the bulls, the tuskers. You might know that Indian elephant populations are suffering from a problem where there are fewer number of tuskers and more number of males that have no tusks, and these are called makhnas. And genetic studies and other studies have identified that this could potentially be the result of specific poaching for tuskers, where now the populations have started producing males without tusks. And this now these males are typically were not involved in reproduction and carrying the herd forward, but now because of the change in dynamics and change in population structure, that has impacted reproductive behavior of elephants too. So when you have a disease that then kills these big tuskers, you again impact that herd structure and herd composition, which in turn might have an impact on reproduction and survival of that herd. But monitoring diseases and health in elephants is very important because of the huge size of the elephant itself. When an elephant dies in the forest, it takes a very long time for that carcass to actually decay and get decomposed and disappear. Whereas if you have smaller animals, they also don't get scavenged very easily compared to smaller animals. So that means that you have a veritable a spot where you have any pathogens. If there are any pathogens or diseases, you have this veritable experimental lab just sitting there where you could collect information from in terms of diseases that might have affected that elephant and that might be prevalent in the ecosystem. So if there is an anthrax, say, in an elephant, the carcass that has been found, then one has to investigate where that anthrax came from, potentially from another elephant or from livestock. And so when you start tracing that, you will identify if that anthrax can be transmitted to has been transmitted to other wild animals, because all mammals are susceptible to anthrax, or if it is tuberculosis that has been transmitted, say, from humans to elephants, then that is an indicator of the close contact between that elephant herd and humans, and the threat to not just the elephants but also to humans from this transmission of tuberculosis back and forth between elephants and humans. So diseases in elephants are actually also an indicator of diseases that are prevalent in the ecosystem and how these diseases could be threats to other wildlife. So in a way, elephants act as sentinels for disease and health of the ecosystem. They also are indicators of the health of the forest. So if an elephant is in good body condition, is healthy, that means that it is getting enough nutrients and enough food from the forest. As long as it's not a crop raiding, elephant or a crop raiding herd, then you know that the forest has good quality vegetation available. There is good forest cover in that forest. Water resources and water quality is good. If the number of gastrointestinal parasites are lower, you know that the soil and water quality might be better than in other areas. Again, elephants need minerals and large amounts of it to maintain their daily, daily nutrient requirements. And this comes from the soil. So again, good health of elephants indicates good soil, minerals, and quality, and overall the intactness of forest. So elephants are again good sentinels for the health of the forest. And finally, like I said, health of elephants is interrelated with the health of livestock, because elephants share a lot of diseases that are found in livestock. And if there is diseases in elephants such as anthrax and tuberculosis and hemorrhagic septicemia, which are actually diseases of livestock, that indicates that there is an issue in the livestock, and this might affect not just the livestock, but also the humans that own them and their livelihoods. So the health of elephants is important for the health of livestock and the humans that depend on them. So literally, the elephant is truly a god for the forest ecosystem, and for all of us humans that depend on these forests, for not only people who live right next to the forest, but all of us who need water, who need rains to survive, who need good soil, who need that the pathogens and vectors stay in away from us, safe inside forests where they typically should be found. With that, I thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience and how you have experience regarding the disease and how it is affecting the biodiversity conservation and so on. So I think now we come to the next session where I think Dr. Rajesh Kumar will be sharing his experience, how his a very long experience of I think almost a decades of experience regarding these issues. So Dr. Rajesh Kumar, the floor is yours.
Good evening to all. And I don't have a very long bad experience with the wildlife, and I'm just 1.5 years old in the wild. But I work in the peripheries of the forest, and I work closely with cattle and livestock. And with the elephants, here the incidence of disease is sporadic only. So far, I have heard. And now the conflict, human-animal conflict is in the wild. And the elephant, the habitat loss and the quality of the habitat is degrading. That is the major issue we are dealing with. But at the same time, we can't neglect the diseases going on in the ecosystem, which is the ecosystem. So I can better start conversation with Bindu. She may put the questions, and I would love to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. Would you mind speaking a little closer to the computer? Your voice is a little
Yes.
low. Okay, that's great. So having given this brief introduction to our audience, I wanted to ask you that as a field vet who has been working with elephants and dealing with diseases in these giants on a daily basis, what are the conditions that you most commonly come across in both captive and wild elephants?
In captive elephants in our camp, mostly we are dealing with injuries because we allow our camp elephants to go deep inside the forest for grazing. Even in the night also, we used to lead them inside the forest. So they interact with the wild elephants. Some tuskers, they used to come and play with our subordinates or spar with them. Sometimes they indulge in infighting also. So this is the most common injuries or conditions we are facing in the captive elephant camp. Otherwise, the incidence of diseases are very rare occurrence. Some 10 years back, there is incidence of herpes virus in cows. But in the past 10 years, I would say we haven't come across any infectious diseases. Coming to the wild elephants, there are sporadic incidents of anthrax, tuberculosis, and herpes viruses. And the parasitic loads, we almost in every elephant we are recording in the postmortem. It's a gastrointestinal parasites. And coming to the cause of mortality in wild elephants, in my experience in the past 1.5 years, the infighting comes the first. The fight among the elephants, the tuskers, between two tuskers, or sometimes the tuskers with the adult cow elephants. And then electrocution is often occurring because they, in the peripheries, the elephant roam into the crop fields and the farmers erecting the electric fences. Sometimes the accident happens. And even some train accidents do happen where the train track running close proximity to the forest. And then in the most of the cases, what I observed is the process of death in elephants starts long before it dies. And slowly the organ system is slowing down. And due to starvation and it's such a huge body, it needs continuous foraging, it has to travel a lot, drink a lot to support such a huge mass. The slow process, slowly it is deteriorating. And at the end, the animal is succumbing to all this stress. So these are the conditions we are facing in the field. Yes.
So, what are some of the challenges that you have faced in, say, treating, wild elephants, or even trying to treat wild elephants?
Yes. In my opinion, we should not treat any wild animals. But the question of treatment arises when the wild elephant, considering the elephant, when it roam out of the forest and come in negative interaction with the humans, or when the injury happened due to the human interventions. So this is the two conditions we may intervene, and the intervention also should be as least as possible. First, we used to treat with oral medications and try to push it away back into the forest. If that doesn't work, we used to go for a single time intervention, and we will try to push it back into the forest. When all the things fails and the animal keep on coming into the human habitations and indulge in negative interaction with the humans, then we are literally forced to take them into the captivity. So this is about treating the elephants. But coming to the treatment, it is really a challenging task because the elephant when it is on its foot, we can't go near it. We can't give any injections or
It
any.
doesn't want to be treated.
Yes, only oral feeding we can give. We even can't go for sedation right away because the sedative stress may cause the animal to collapse because we don't know what is happening inside the system. What is their blood parameters, how much the infection or anything has happened inside the body. So treating itself is a challenge. And again, the elephant come out of the forest only when it literally give up its forest life. It feels that I can't survive here anymore. I can't fend for my daily happenings here. I can't face the challenges from my fellow species. It's at that point of the time only it comes out of the human habitat. It's literally the death process has started in most of the cases. So the animal will, when it's on its foot, we try with oral medication, or when it lie down, it's almost it's done. 99% of the cases should be ending death. This is the bitter truth that everyone has to accept.
Yes.
And another one important thing is any rescue operations or treatment operations. Nowadays the first thing hurdle we are facing is the crowd management. See,
Yes.
most of the wildlife rescues and cases, the death occur due to the stress. Even the stress is in the various forms. Even what they hear, or the new voices, sound, the visual stimuli, the touch, everything is a stress. But in present condition, whenever there is any incident of rescue or treatment, the local people gather there, and a lot of other stakeholders who don't have any part in the rescue operation, they do gather there. All and they used to intervene in our treatment protocol also. Everyone will give their own thoughts, ideas. So the whole mess of a thing. We are facing all those things, and we are trying to do our best.
So really interesting. That actually comes back to that talk about how elephants that you said, they come out of the forest only when it has really no other resource left, and it really needs either food, or it is really that sick, or it has been injured that badly, or it needs to get out because of infighting with. And that all comes down to that problem about how habitats are decreasing or shrinking, or they're degrading. And so there is just not enough forest left for these elephants, which is why they come out. They don't come out because they want to, they come out because they are forced to. And that is something we really need to keep in mind. So
and
when,
one
yeah.
point I want to add upon is, in the past, there were enough buffer zones between the forest and the industrial activity of the humans. So in those days,
we couldn't hear you, sorry.
Yes. Another one important point I want to mention is, in the past, there was enough buffer zone between the forest and the human habitations. Any injured elephant, if it should have come out of the forest, it used to roam into the buffer, and the nature will take its call.
Exactly.
But now, the next step out of RF is a crop field or a national highway or some developmental projects. That also will add upon to this. I just want to make a
correct. There is a very abrupt edge to the forest. There is no buffer at all in which the elephant can, come out and be away from human habitations. So what are the challenges in diagnosing a cause of death when you find a dead elephant in the forest, for example?
The most common challenges, we used to identify the carcass 2 or 3 days, or sometimes even after 7 days or 10 days. We know that after 48 hours of death, the automatic changes and postmortem changes, the PM invaders take over the carcass, PM bloating, PM staining, everything. We are not unable to, we can't appreciate any gross pathological results. This is the main challenge. And some cases we are able to zero in on the cause, like gore injuries or some electric cases or accidental fall. This external trauma and all, we are able to sort it out, even if the carcass is 3-4 days old or a week old. But coming to the case of infectious diseases or any contagious diseases, because of the want of observing the cross lesions, we feel it difficult. Even though we used to collect samples and screen them, send them to laboratories, and we get results. The correlating the gross lesions and the laboratory findings is literally impossible here. Yeah, a perfect diagnosis is, in my opinion, we have to correlate the gross lesions and even the history and also the laboratory findings. So this is the constraint we feel, and yes, yeah, this is it.
Yeah, I think then that brings up the importance of the screening and monitoring for diseases in wild animals, right? Especially elephants, because by the time the animal in wild animals, you don't see apparent disease, right? We can't follow each animal and look at it every day, and so we miss out signs of apparent disease, unlike in domestic animals or livestock, and or even in humans. So we have to proactively go out and monitor and screen these wild animals, even if they're not showing signs of disease, because by the time disease becomes apparent, you can see the disease in these animals. They're at the last stages, and there's literally very little you can do to help them, and they'll die. Even if they do die, it is very difficult to find these carcasses and figure out how they died, what they could have died of. So, but if we have regular screening and monitoring practices that we start right in the beginning itself, screening even the apparently healthy herds, we would have some idea of what is happening in these herds, what are the kind of pathogens that are moving in these herds. And then if there is a death or a disease outbreak that happens, or some animal falls sick, we have some idea of what that might be. Also, when we do know what are the pathogens that are circulating in this herd, it also helps us understand what are the factors, changes in the environment, or changes in the food, or changes in the herd structure that might cause that disease to flare up and create an outbreak. And so then that helps us prepare for those kind of incidences. So this is something I really like to emphasize to a lot of people who tell me that, oh, but the elephant herds look healthy, we've never seen any disease in them. But the problem is we will rarely see disease in them. By the time we figure out that there is a disease in them, it's too late, and we're not able to even diagnose it because of the way the carcasses are, lack of laboratory facilities, or ability to transport the samples immediately to the labs, and many other issues. So I think that is why definitely we must push for proactive screening and monitoring and surveillance in animals, whether the herds are healthy or not. And I'd like to ask, now talking about these challenges, what are some of the challenges that field vets face, and what can be done to improve the health and well-being of wild elephants?
Yes, the number of wildlife vets are very limited, and the conflict cases are keep on rising. When compared to some 10 years back, the same veterinary studies, wildlife vet studies carried over till now. But when we take the statistics of the conflicts, not only with the elephants, all these carnivores, and other things, it's keep on rising. We are unable to handle them, all these things. The strength of the veterinary cadre should be improved. And in the forest department, they are more concerned about poaching and other developmental activities. Regarding the disease management and the ecological management, still a lot need to be done. And coming to the screening, it is literally difficult to screen wild elephant in the wild population. So that concern is that we have to look into intensive screening of the livestock cattle in the peripheral areas. These things are being done now by animal husbandry department. They have their own agenda about protection, breeding, and all. But specific look with the wild animal angle of view, and the screening has to be done. So So these things are not being done now. For all these things, we need more veterinarians or such people to work in that line. And yes, regarding the improving the health of wildlife, we have to improve the habitat quality, and also the corridors has to be secured, especially for these migratory animals like elephants. But when we think about the root cause, it's a global warming, the climate change.
Yeah.
When we think about the cause for the climate change and global warming, it is purely or not purely, mostly because of the anthropogenic activities. So the resources we consume, the water we use in excess, all our for our comforts, we use more resources than what we need to take, and we keep on reproducing also. The first thing, in my opinion, the population check has to be happen in the humans. Then
Absolutely.
that is where the conservation starts. And also, the conservation is not about inside the forest, and it is not limited to the forest department. So every individual has a part, and the conservation starts with every drop of water we use, every drop of fuel we burn, the way we use. We have to, in everything, we have to look into the angle of nature, what it means for the forest, what it means for the climate change. I think there is a more space for us to live in harmony with nature. There is enough for everyone's needs, but there is nothing here for even for a single man's greed. So that's what I feel.
Yes, I agree with you totally that I think human population growth and human consumption, human greed, so to say, is the main root cause of all our problems, not just in terms of conservation, but also in terms of poverty and disparity and everything else. So it all comes down to that in the end. And also elephant conservation will suffer as long as there are humans that are wanting more and more of the elephant's habitat. So the main conservation practice that we need to focus on would be population control. Yeah. So so I have been like also talking about the challenges in screening, like you were talking about the difficulties in screening and monitoring for diseases in wild animals. Now, I tend to disagree because coming from a background where, you know, and having worked in an area where I've seen how you can actually screen and monitor for diseases in wild animals, some are invasive methods, some are non-invasive methods. The point is that we are just not giving the kind of importance that it needs. This issue needs. We are not given that kind of support where, you know, we can feel free to go and collect samples and conduct these screening and monitoring issues. As you very rightly pointed out, disease screening and health is not currently a big priority with the departments or even with the government. And even among the people, until a COVID-19 happens, people don't really think about disease or animals and diseases from animals at all. But the thing is, it's not something that's difficult. Many countries are already doing it. Nepal is leading us in that process. Actually, Nepal is very proactive about managing its elephants and disease screening for diseases, screening for reproductive parameters, and really having a very detailed information about the elephants, wild elephants that they have. Of course, that is a much smaller population. However, it is also a much smaller country and a smaller force of people that are doing that work. So I think when you look at that, there is a chance, there is a potential to scale up that. There is a potential to replicate some of that success in our country. And we have enough and more human talent and intelligence and labs and people who are doing this kind of stuff. So I think first is the impetus from the departments and government. And the second is, I think, a change in attitude among people also. That disease and health is relegated to the back, but it should not be. It is very important that we pay attention to diseases in animals in our environment also, because that is an indicator of what is going to happen to our environment, whether urban or rural or forest, and also to us in turn, right? So I think it is very important that we, and even though we have challenges in screening and monitoring, and like you correctly said, you can use correlates like such as screening for diseases in livestock, much better screening than what is happening currently, and screening specifically for diseases that could be transmitted between livestock and wildlife. That is very important. And more than screening, I think correct reporting of these diseases when they do occur will help us to proactively prevent future outbreaks or catastrophic fatalities because of these diseases. So I think that is very important.
So I also want to mention one point. Currently, we are monitoring the health of the elephants in an indirect way. How means in our captive elephants, we used to go for routine screening for all bacterial and viral diseases. These captive elephants are reared in such a way that they almost go and interact with the wild elephants daily. And also, since they are also engaged in tourism, elephant safaris, and other exhibits, they are also exposed to anthropogenic pathogens also. So
Yes.
these captive elephants and the screening them for a disease act as an indicator of what is going on in the wild. So in that sense, we are at least have an idea of what's going on in the wild, though we are not going directly into the
yes, that would be a good surrogate too to understand what is happening in wild populations. I agree with you completely. Yeah. So yeah. So I think
I have one question for you.
Yeah.
Yes. In some days back in Botswana, there is a mass death of elephants that happened. Actually, what was the root cause, and how it affects the conservation, and how we should be prepared to such a thing not to happen in our landscape. So can you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, sure. So in the case of Botswana, in 2020, 350 elephants, African elephants had died, for those who do not know. And in 2021, again, 30 more elephants, 30 to 40 elephants were found dead in Botswana, and another 30 to 40 elephants were found dead in neighboring Namibia. And although the scientists have tried to figure out, there were lots of theories about whether it was a viral disease or a bacterial disease or whether it was toxins, they have now come up with cyanobacteria being one of the major causes. So cyanobacteria are blue-green algae that grow on ponds or lakes, due to eutrophication, which means that you have a lot of growth of algae that cause this lack of oxygen in the ponds, which leads to lack of growth of helpful microorganisms that keep the pond healthy. And so these cyanobacteria release a kind of toxin which is toxic to all animals, in fact. So because not all animals were affected in this case, and mostly it was just elephants that were acutely affected. So now the scientists think that it was a combination of cyanobacteria releasing toxins, which the elephants went to that water source to drink from that water source and got affected by that. Plus, they were also affected by starvation because Botswana had been experiencing severe drought for a few years, and there was lack of nutrition for the elephants. So they were already having severe food issues. So they were starvation could have complicated that. And the third was a virus called the endomyocarditis virus, which is a virus that is that has caused diseases and deaths in elephants in Africa previously, and which has been found in this herd in Botswana, also in a few elephants that were found dead. And so it seems that it was a combination of all of these three factors that could have resulted in the deaths, and these deaths continue to happen. Now it's important Botswana has 13,000 elephants, so the death of 350 elephants was not really such a big deal for them. But it was very important because the same kind of deaths happened in Namibia. And those elephants also used to use the same water resources. Now, animals do not have boundaries. So although it did not affect Botswana's elephant population as such, it did affect the entire it does affect the African population as a whole. It affects Namibian population. And so it is important to investigate these deaths and diseases, even if it is just a small number of deaths in a small population in your area and does not seem to impact the other areas, it is very important to understand it, because you never know when it is going to become a problem for the other populations and when it is going to become a problem for other wild animals. So the elephants were a sentinel actually, because of which now the veterinarians started looking for symptoms in other animals that use that same water resources for toxicity because of the cyanobacteria. So the elephants acted as, like, a signal, a whistleblower, so to say. So that way, it's very important to look at elephant health in terms of conservation and how we can avoid something similar. We did have something similar in Jaipur, in Rajasthan, in Sambar Lake, when so many birds died, and again, apparently due to toxicity, due to cyanobacteria, so algal growth. Now, again, the same thing happens. So we have to, as you very correctly said, we also have to do, apart from disease screening in the animals themselves, we also have to do ecological monitoring of the habitat. Look at habitat factors, look at soil, test for water, test the soil, look at vegetation quality and how it is changing. So all of these things combined need to be brought in together to develop a proper wildlife health management plan. Not just wildlife, it also impacts health of livestock and humans. So I call it the community health management plan, literally. And this is something now we are trying to do with our work in Mudumalai. And that is why it is very important to look at health aspects in conservation.
Yes, you are right. We have to look for the water bodies, the behavioral pattern of the elephants, feeding pattern. We have to go for any phytotoxins, because the thing is that there is this invasive species and exotic species are taking over our native species. And so when there is a scarcity for fodder, the elephants might have looked for another non-conventional sources. What are the toxins, what are the impacts on the digestive systems and the hepatic system?
Absolutely.
Yes, we need to.
Traditionally, they would have had the knowledge to avoid the certain foods, but those were in terms of indigenous varieties, right? But when you have exotic and introduced species of plants, the elephants do not have that inherent knowledge of whether this is good for me or bad for me, and so they might end up eating something, as you said, which is toxic for them, leading to
yeah, we need
diseases.
Yes, I want to mention another one thing. In most of the postmortems, some sort of degenerative changes in the liver we are able to appreciate. It might be due to any phytotoxins or something like that. In the time also, we need to concentrate more. This is the disease. We have to concentrate on that thing. This is my.
Exactly. Well, I think this has been a great conversation with you, Doc, and maybe we can now move on to question and answers from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rajesh Kumar. So I have a small question for you. That is I have almost no idea about the whole thing, so it's maybe same very layman question. As we have been talking about the screening process, and we have heard that the screening process is not that great in India till now. So as of now, what is the situation when you try to find out any disease in the wildlife? And if you find out any animal is infected, how is the process? Especially for the animals who stays in a herd, it is very tough for uh, disperse them because they always try to stay together. So what is the process and how you try to manage all these things? So it's like a question for you.
So Dr. Rajesh, that question is for you.
Yeah. Yes, if as far as the elephant is concerned, if the animal is infected or if it is injured, it is unable to cope up with the movement of the herd will abandon the elephant. Even the calves, they will abandon and they will wander around and they will succumb to the infection or injuries or whatever it may be. This is a unique behavior in the elephants. And if we come across such an elephant and we are able to diagnose that is there an infectious disease or something like that, there is a SOP for disposing the carcass. For example, if it is a case of an anthrax, we have to totally burn the carcass. We have to place a barricade around the area. We have to disinfect with flame guns the soil and other particles we used during the process, and we have to closely observe that area for some 1 year or two, so that no animals will enter into that area and pick up the infection. Some standard operating protocols are there.
Thank you so much. So I would like to hand it over to Anikethan so that he can moderate the questions from the audience. So Anikethan.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Raghavan and Dr. Kumar, for such a thorough and informative talk. Actually, between the conversation between you two, I think most of the questions have been answered. But there are a few questions in the chat box. This question is for Dr. Bindu from Vadiraj. He asks, Madam, how do you put the potential of an outbreak of hemorrhagic septicemia, since the same water bodies are used by livestock and elephants in fragmented habitats?
Okay, I'm guessing what you mean to ask is how do you reduce the potential of an outbreak of hemorrhagic septicemia, right? So again, in this case, it is if livestock are potentially infected with hemorrhagic septicemia, then we have to ensure that the livestock do not use that water body or use an alternative water source. So in case of livestock, we can give them water in troughs and stall feed them, but in terms of elephants, that just is not possible. So the elephants really do not have an alternative. So the only way we can control this is to manage it in livestock, and the only way we can do that is to manage the water source, because again, hemorrhagic septicemia in livestock can still be treated, can still be acted upon. We can vaccinate them. First of all, vaccination would be the first step. Vaccination against HS in all the livestock that reside in areas which elephants use. And second of all is by managing use of those shared water resources in such a way that elephants are not exposed to diseased livestock or diseases from livestock that are already infected by these organisms. So again, as I go back to my same mantra, is screening, and monitoring. There is no other way of preventing this. But despite how big and how massive that project sounds of screening and monitoring, it is still, and there have been studies, economic studies that have been conducted by animal health professionals and wildlife health professionals, and that is still cheaper than actually dealing with die-offs or infections once that has happened in a herd, especially in wild animals or even in livestock. So screening and monitoring is still a cheaper method to tackle a disease than treating and curing or vaccinating later. So.
And actually, there is another question from him. I think this question will be for both of the speakers. Are there any non-invasive test techniques for the screening of disease in wild populations?
Dr. Rajesh, do you want to take that, or shall I?
No, I think you will be the better person to answer that.
So yes, so what non-invasive means is where you don't touch the animal to collect samples, right? So the most popular is looking at fecal samples, dung samples, to look for gastrointestinal parasites. Now there are also tests that are being developed to look for Mycobacterium tuberculosis in dung samples, to look for anthrax organisms in dung samples, and several other organisms. Because of PCR, now everybody knows about PCR thanks to COVID-19. So the PCR is such an important and very useful tool because it can detect very small amounts of DNA, and the organism doesn't need to be alive. In the olden times, we used to have to, take a swab, culture the bacteria, which means basically grow the bacteria or the virus in the lab and then see if it is the bacteria or virus that we're looking at and which has caused the disease. But now you just need to find a very small fragment of the DNA of that bacteria or virus, and a lot of this is shared by animals which are sick through their feces also, or through the urine. And so, or sometimes even when, if it is a bacteria or virus that affects the reproductive canal, so in reproductive afterbirth. So, if you know that an animal has given birth in a particular area, you can go and collect soil samples or afterbirth samples from that area and use that to test for disease. So there are many, many techniques, and more are being developed every day, and we should be looking at these options. It's just because there has not been much, as I said, much enthusiasm or impetus from the policymakers to look at wildlife health. So there has not been much emphasis even in our laboratories or our diagnostic facilities to develop these tests. Once there is an interest, these tests can be developed very easily. We definitely have the manpower, we definitely have the intelligence, and we have the technical know-how. So it's just a matter of time.
And actually, I also had a question.
Yes.
You had mentioned about the zoonotic diseases, ma'am.
Yes.
And I want to ask, how easy is it for a disease is it to cross the species barrier, and what would be the factors?
Okay. Yeah. So it depends on the pathogen. For a lot of bacteria, it is quite easy to cross species barriers, mainly because bacteria are a large genera. Most bacteria are large genera, and there are certain subspecies which infect different kinds of hosts. And there is a lot of exchange of genetic material between these subspecies. So it is much easier for bacteria to jump hosts actually. A little less difficult for viruses, but there are certain groups of viruses that are more able to jump hosts and certain groups of viruses that are absolutely not able to jump hosts because of the kind of genetic material they have. So for example, DNA, viruses that have DNA as their genetic material find it more difficult to cross species because entire DNA has to be integrated into a host DNA for it to be able to, multiply in that host. And so there are, like, in technical terms, it needs to be actually compatible with that host DNA to be able to integrate there. It's much easier for RNA viruses because RNA is a very small fragment of genetic material, very easy to integrate into host DNA. And so those viruses, such as the coronaviruses, find it very easy to jump hosts. And still, it is not that easy as we think. It does take time. And factors such as climate change or like I said, sudden expansion of, the host diversity for a virus. For example, when a forest is cut down and suddenly you have this large amount of hosts that are available to you, which were not available earlier, that helps the virus jump. It doesn't directly jump from a bat to a human. It does go through several steps in between. There are other species that are involved, but we only notice it once it comes to the humans, and we don't realize the different steps that have taken place in between. So yeah. Have I answered your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And actually, I had another question.
Sure.
Ma'am, we see many invasive plants and species in our like lantana, euphorium, etc., etc. And are there cases of these invasive diseases which have caused a lot of problem in our ecosystems?
So in terms of health or in terms of general?
Generally, ma'am.
Yes, lantana and eupatorium, as Dr. Rajesh Kumar will also tell you. So I call them the stranglers of the Indian forest. They are strangling our forest literally, because what happens is they spread indiscriminately over the forest floor. They do not allow germination of native forest trees and herbs and shrubs. And that means that, these can't regenerate. First of all. Second is because lantana covers this huge expanse of area, and it is very thick. If you've ever seen lantana bushes, they're so thick you can't penetrate them. They're impenetrable in many places, so animals cannot move. They stop animal movement. Lantana leaves are not really palatable. The berries are eaten by certain animals and birds, but not everybody. So it really does not help animals in any way. It's not nutritious. It's, in fact, it does have a lot of phytotoxins and indigestible elements. So it's not really something that most wildlife can use. So they are, and eupatorium is another invasive like that, just like that. Although it's not as bad as lantana in terms of movement and stuff, but it typically again prevents regeneration of native plant species, and that again causes loss of forest quality. So, and then in general, you have less food plants available for animals. So then animals starve, and then there's population declines, and you lose animals from that area.
And ma'am, also the biological magnification. So all of these chemicals and all of these released into the ecosystem, are there any cases of new kinds of problems which are being faced by because of this chemical discharge and etc. and all of the industrial impact on the ecosystem?
Yes, absolutely. So the fish are a very good example, right? I don't know if you know, but in the Netherlands, there was a recent study that was published in Nature that in Netherlands, they found 75% of the humans that they tested had microplastics in their blood. Where did that microplastic come from? Because it came from the fish that they eat. And where did it come in the fish? It came from, say, smaller crustaceans that the fish may have fed on, or directly from algae or food that the fish have fed on within the sea. And in the sea, it came from us. We threw our garbage, including microplastics, into the sea. And so that is a great example of biomagnification, how microplastics have moved from the point of source where we have thrown it out into the humans, into our blood. So in terms of animals, a very good example in terms of biomagnification, not just in terms of chemicals and fertilizers and stuff, but also in terms of actual pathogens. So antimicrobial resistance is a very good example of biomagnification in terms of biological things, right? So antimicrobial resistance is when bacteria especially become resistant to certain antibiotics and antimicrobials that we use because we've used them so indiscriminately. Okay, so what happens is, I told you that they can exchange genes very easily among themselves. So these antimicrobial genes are specific kind of genes that they can exchange very easily among bacteria. And so once one bacteria becomes resistant to antibiotics, it can transfer that gene to another bacteria which it has not seen before. And now they have found these antimicrobial resistance genes in fishes and penguins in Antarctica. Okay, nobody has used antimicrobials in Antarctica. How did it reach there? Right? So that's again biomagnification, because they fed on fishes or krill or crustaceans or copepods or whatever it is from that have traveled or eaten, again, been exposed to their prey, which has been exposed to antimicrobials used in fishes, maybe in our fishery industries and shrimp industries. And that's how it has moved all the way to Antarctica. So that's biomagnification in the scale of biological organisms.
So you say that there might be super bacteria or super viruses in the future?
Not maybe, there are already super bacteria and super viruses. Yes. The multi-drug resistant Staphylococcus aureus is a super bug.
So sir, Rajesh sir, actually I had a question for you. What are the main challenges, sir, in interacting with the domestic animals, sir? So during the talk, most of the time we heard that the main problem is diseases crossing over from the domestic stock to the wild animals. So what are the main challenges that you face in countering this problem?
See, the most of the people dwelling inside the protected areas, they have livestock breeding as a livelihood, and they used to go and graze along inside the forest areas. Unfortunately, the system is unable to stop that. They used to share the common waterfalls. So that is the problem. But in my opinion, most of the breeds they are having are native breeds, the local breeds. They are almost like semi-wild only. If we can leave them just like that, in my opinion, but we should not import any cross breeds or exotic breeds into that system, because they are those which are more vulnerable to diseases, and they may import more diseases out of the protected areas. So just like a deer or a boar roaming through the forest, these semi-domesticated animals are also they will be roam inside, and they may go and interact with the animals that won't have much of an impact. On the other side, we will give vaccinations. We will do screening for diseases. If there is any contagious disease affecting the domestic cattle, we may tell them also. And we have to limit the anthropogenic activities. See, if there is a herd of domestic cattle inside the protected area, they have no contact with the other cattle. But we people used to go in our vehicles or we go for tourism or any other activities, we may carry the virus or bacteria in our vehicles, in our shirts, in our shoes, everything. So that change we need to limit as much as possible. That's my opinion on that.
Yes, sir. So we have another question from Kalai Vanan. They ask that once diseases like TB and gastrointestinal worms and salmonella, etc., have been found by non-invasive technique, how can it be managed, and what kind of management option is available?
I would like to extend that question. He's asked some more detailed question about related to that, saying some park management are administering dewormers in the artificial salt lick. Is it advisable? Unscientific, unplanned, abnormal number of water holes in salt lick creation, whether affect animal health, and is it predisposing cause for wildlife diseases? So I think these are all interrelated. If I may, Dr. Rajesh, I'll just answer this. So the one way to when you find gastrointestinal parasites in the in fecal samples of wild animals, there is nothing much you can do for the wild animals as such. In the wild animals as such, what you need to do is now figure out where those gastrointestinal parasites have come from. So often, what we do in these parasite studies is we just leave it at the identification of the species of the parasite or genus of the parasite mostly, and just leave it at that. But just finding parasites in the feces is not necessarily indicative of bad health. It's only when the load of parasites is very high and that combines with other stressors that it becomes a problem for the wildlife. The issue is that in order to reduce the presence of parasites in wildlife, we have to make sure that they are grazing as little as possible in areas that are used also by livestock, and that the livestock that are grazing there have been vaccinated. I am totally against deworming on a regular deworming schedules, because it has been proven worldwide that that is leading to antihelminthic resistance, right? Resistance to these dewormers. So that is not helping us either. The need for deworming only arises when the load of parasites in any animal or herd is so high that it is going to affect their health and well-being, that it is going to affect their ability to fight disease or ability to gain nutrition or ability to survive. Until then, there is no real need to use dewormers. The only thing we can do is habitat management and grazing management, so that these animals do not share the same spaces. Most of these parasitic infestations do resolve by themselves unless there are certain specific parasites like hookworms or lungworms, or that actually cause acute disease in animals that are infected. In those cases, yes, there is a case made for deworming. And in those cases for wild animals, typically in countries abroad, what is done is that they start provisioning the animals from beforehand itself, and so the animals get accustomed to eating certain delicacies, so we say, and then you introduce the dewormer into that food, so all the animals are able to eat. Now again, not all the animals will get the same amount of food, but that concept of herd immunity works the same way in deworming too. So if most of the herd has been able to be dewormed, the parasites are not able to maintain within that herd, and so that helps to control the parasite load within that herd. So those are some of the ways that we can manage that. I agree, sir, that unplanned abnormal number of water holes and salt licks can be a problem, because you are encouraging different species to come and drink from the same water hole. But again, you can avoid that also by monitoring the water quality and surrounding areas of the water hole. Water holes, I think, are also great disease investigation areas, because that also gives you an opportunity to test that entire area. If some animals are shedding anything, then you can test the soil and the water there, and fecal samples that you collect from there, and that is a great indicator of any diseases that are present in that herd. So there is some use for them too, but it has to be used in moderation, and one has to use them wisely.
Yes, ma'am. And I want to ask, ma'am, most of people, when they hear disease, they think it's all bad and disease must be eradicated, all that. But we all know that diseases have played a very important role in the evolution of all of the species. So forgive me for speaking ironically here. What would be a healthy level of diseases in wild populations?
So again, like Dr. Rajesh also pointed out, like not all disease, not animals don't die of all diseases, right? Unless they're in such bad shape and then they succumb to the disease. A lot of disease is inapparent. We just don't know. They suffer from it, and some animals might die, but the rest of the herd will recover and go on with it. So I think the indicator of what is bad in a herd is when a herd starts showing like many animals are dying, or certain groups of animals are dying, like very young animals or very old animals or breeding animals. Then you have to be worried. But again, because at that point it is difficult to start collecting samples and sending to the labs to test what it might be, it is important to screen beforehand itself in the healthy herd, and then we have an idea of the potential suspects that might be there, and then we can say, okay, it could be one of these suspects because we've seen them in this herd, and the conditions seem to have been right for this outbreak, and so now we have to treat them accordingly, or quarantine or isolate or whatever it is that we need to do. That helps us develop a strategy to manage that disease in that herd.
So I would like to invite everybody to post questions in the chat box. Like I said, ma'am, your questioning with Rajesh sir was so thorough that most of the questions have been answered.
Yeah, sure, no worries.
So we'll wait for somebody if anybody wants to post any questions. Sure.
I am going to post my email here in the chat in case anybody has specific questions or would like to connect. You're most welcome. Here is my email.
Yeah, ma'am, I think nobody else is asking any questions. So
sure.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And it has been a very informative talk. And thank you for all the anecdotes and the knowledge you've given us. So I would like to hand it over to Esha.
Thank you, Anikethan. So I think we are at the last stage of today's session. So thank you so much to our speakers for being here today, and you have given a wonderful time, and we have learned a lot, I think. And especially for me, it was a totally new topic, almost a new topic for me. So it was very enriching. I think we have a lot of audience from a different section. Not always, all everybody is from wildlife, and everybody is from the similar background. So I think it had been a wonderful session for whoever was present here. So thank you so much, Dr. Bindu Raghavan and Dr. Rajesh Kumar. And I would like to thank all the audience who has been here for the whole session and listen to us. And we expect that next month we will be coming with another much, and good night.
Thank you very much for having us, and thank you to the audience too.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.